The player you're most excited to have for the playoffs is that more this week on the couch. Happy to be joined again by Davis Mattek. Davis, fantasy football playoffs are almost here. Who are you most excited to click a little check mark next to?
I think there's only one name, and that is Devon A-Chain. I know he said it was A-Chan, and all due respect, A-Chain just sounds way cooler. I don't really see how it could be anyone else, because if you're in the fantasy football playoffs and you have him, your team was probably pretty good. Maybe you traded for him, right? By hook or by crook. Maybe someone had to drop him because he's been injured forever. But I don't think any player, maybe Christian McCaffrey, maybe Justin Jefferson when he comes back, has a higher single game ceiling than he does at this point. It feels like a lot of the teams are going to be getting him back. It'll be like, getting Charles Johnson, or Chris Johnson is probably the right comp for him. Probably not Jamal Charles, probably Johnson. And I think it's a legit comp, and he is the one who I'm most excited about for sure.
Yeah, we just need his knee to get through a game. Just no bulky knee. But I think you're right to point to Miami's offense and always be thinking in terms of explosive offenses. And with Achane, you don't even have to say what if. He already did it. It's the perfect storm, the spacing. I remember I was real fascinated with him because of the way that Miami made defenses so spaced out, and it created so many downfield passing plays. And then we saw earlier in the year that Mike McDaniel wasn't just going to do what he did last year, that standing still in the NFL is falling behind, and Achane's the man. And if not Achane, because this is probably the most common thing that makes me want to shake my fist at a cloud, is whenever you have the situation, but maybe not the right player. So right. Jeff Wilson should be on a roster just in case. And heck, we might be talking about Darrington Evans because Salvon Ahmed's on IR. Chris Brooks is on IR. So we might have been talking about Chris Brooks if he hadn't gone down. But if one thing has come through in this fantasy season, Davis, there's nothing so absurd that you should say that can't happen, right?
That's just a good lesson for it's a good lesson for life in general, right? It's just don't be ruling out things that are firmly in the realm of completely possible. But yeah, this has been kind of every year fantasy football gets a little bit wilder. I think there are a lot of reasons for that.
Yeah.
Honestly, I think one of the most overlooked reasons is just that we are so good at projecting the median outcome that when things that are not the median happen, we are more surprised and annoyed by them, So, and things in reality very rarely are going to hew towards the median. How often does a player exactly match their median or mean projection? Honestly, this season feels, nuts. Half the first round picks have just straight up busted. I believe the stat is that of all players, all the 36 players who were on average drafted in the first 3 rounds, I think over 30% of them have missed at least one game with an injury, many of them multiples. So yeah, it feels definitely being in the season, it feels nuts.
Yeah, it is nuts. Well, and there are things even that any kind of sound analysis would have never led you to. And I'm going to talk about your Cowboys here, right? If you were to say which coaching staff would make mid-season adjustments during the bye that would turn their offense into an absolute passing juggernaut, they probably would have been, well, maybe not last because there are other coaches like Arthur Smith's in the league, okay? But very, very far down there. And right now, who are you starting over Dak Prescott? Jalen Hurts and Josh Allen. And if you have Dak Prescott and CJ Stroud, I'm sure some teams do, that might give you make smoke come out of your ears when you're like, oh, who am I going to?
Right.
And even CJ Stroud, even for 4 or 5 weeks, Joshua Dobbs for his first 3 weeks, they might get benched, but for 3 weeks, Zach Moss might be a league winner. Zach Moss, how many people even had him as somebody before the Jonathan Taylor drama that we should care about?
How many even drafted? Yeah.
Right. So we, like you said, in life, it's good too. And I don't, and like you said, we're getting really good at projecting the mean or median, or just in general, if you've been along this fantasy football trip for at least 5 or 10 years, the information has gotten much more widely disseminated. There's
Oh
not
yeah.
information gaps anymore. Maybe there's you try to get an edge by the types of information you care about, but I don't even think there's strictly a way to exploit that, Davis, because like certain things you might say, well, the analytics led you to the right answer. Certain things you might say, well, narrative led you to the right answer. Certain things you might say, just like being a really simplistic thinker and just like buying high on Zach Moss because I don't care what we thought about him. He looked really good in one week, so I'm going to just do the dumb thing and say maybe he's actually good. You know, those there's no one technique or one school of thought that's always going to lead you to the right answer. You should be familiar with all the different ways to get there. So, just revisiting the Cowboys really quickly is another thing that's going to happen this year, that Tony Pollard is going to be a league winner. And let me do a quick rant for a second, because if you say back in the day, or maybe even this year still, Davis, people were saying, oh, great, you drafted Bijan Robinson. He's getting you a win for your 3-10 fantasy football team. Well, that's the total nonsense. There's no
Right.
player that should have sunk your team because it's been such a tumultuous season. And for that matter, we are really nullifying our role as fantasy football analysts, or the idea of fantasy football analysis, because it's just one pick. And you've got waiver wire moves, the Matt Waldman 4 legs of the table. The draft's just one leg of the table. So there's no way, no, you can't lose your draft in the first round. So with that in mind, will you be happy you drafted Tony Pollard after all?
I don't think so. I would like to say yes, because I was so confident and so excited to draft Tony Pollard when the 2023 trip began. I think the issue you run into there is that he's very unlikely to get the sort of 23 touch performance that the efficiency he is performing at right now requires. I actually think there's like a pretty reasonable argument to be made that he and Travis Etienne are actually not really having that different of a season, but the Jaguars are content to give Etienne every opportunity to score touchdowns, content to throw him the ball 4 to 5 times a game. They are not designing touches for Dearness Johnson the way that they are clearly designing stuff for Rico Dowdle, although you definitely do want to have Dearness Johnson on your fantasy teams right now, just as one of the better handcuff options that are pretty widely available, even in, good leagues. But really the answer is, at the end of the day, the story of the season is not about the Cowboys rushing game. It's about Dak. It's about Lamb. It's about Cooks. It's about Ferguson. And so sure, maybe he averages 16.5, 17.5 fantasy points down the stretch. And we kind of forget that he stinks, or stunk at the beginning of the first half of the season. But I don't think that he is going to end up being the story of the back half of the season.
You're a Cowboys fan, right?
I was a Cowboys fan. So I was a long time Cowboys fan growing up, my dad, all that stuff. But one, you get very tired of being on the losing end of that bargain, and
Yeah.
I moved to Kansas City the year that Patrick Mahomes got drafted by the Chiefs. I was there for his first career start. All that stuff. And it was impossible to not get wrapped up in that. So I changed my allegiances. And you know what? Honestly, I don't feel bad about it at all. If the Cowboys win the Super Bowl, I'll feel very happy for my dad, whatever. But I don't, that's not a relationship that I spend a lot of time pining over, for sure.
Well, because it was a relationship including Jerry Jones, right? So
exactly.
That's hard, makes it more difficult to love the team. And they would have to beat Philadelphia and San Francisco on the road to even get to the Super Bowl. And that's probably where like the kryptonite for Mike McCarthy is going to be, when he actually has to coach his way out of a paper bag, because they're winning games with they probably do have the best roster in the NFL, just pure talent.
Sure.
But they don't deploy them as well as, say, the Chiefs do. Well, since you brought up the Chiefs, what about Isiah Pacheco as our playoff MVP?
Yeah, I think that he runs into the same issue that he ran into last year, which is that when the going gets tough and the sledding is as hard as it's going to get, as steep as it gets, Jerick McKinnon comes in.
But
McKinnon he's got a groin injury, so he didn't play last week. You know what they did? They played Clyde, man. Clyde was in there getting goal line carries.
Yes.
I just honestly, this is where I'm at with the Chiefs right now. I think that we just have to temper our expectations across the board for Mahomes, for Kelsey, for Rice, for all of them. They are, and I can't believe I'm saying this, I mean, they are a running defense team right now. They are the only team in the NFL that has not allowed more than 25 points in a single game this season. They are very happy, and Brady and the Patriots would go through these runs as well, where if the wide receiver talent wasn't right, before Gronk, there was a Gronk season in there when Gronk kept getting hurt, where they were like, you know what, we are going to win every game 19-16. It's not going to be fun. The fans aren't going to like it, but we're going to get our wins. And that, to me, this feels like the in-between year for Reed and Mahomes.
Right, when they still win a Super Bowl, probably. You remember who the number one receiver was for that first Patriots Brady Belichick team that won the Super Bowl?
It was a converted wide. It was like a converted cornerback, Troy Brown. I was going to say Deion Brown, Troy Brown.
Yeah, Troy Brown. I remember because he returned a punt for a touchdown against the Steelers in the AFC Championship. I was going to go to that Super Bowl. It was here in New Orleans. I think you could get tickets to that game for $100. I remember I had friends who drove from Austin. It was like one of the last Super Bowl you could just walked up and bought a ticket for amount of money that, like, is not absurd.
Kind of crazy.
Yeah, again, we were talking about before we went on the air, being alive long enough to see things change. Speaking of my Steelers, so got all black and gold, my Doc Ellis gear today. Are you buying it? Was it just that simple? Fire the offensive coordinator?
Yeah, I think the number one thing can be illustrated by the first play on the first third down on the first drive, which was a play action throw right up the seam to Pat Freiermuth. Not a play. Canada was in charge for 52 games, right?
Right.
Was that yeah?
Something.
Don't think I saw that play ran a single time under Matt Canada, and that is like a staple of good NFL offenses, right? Is just that very simple, quick throw up the seam. I mean, you got to trust your quarterback, right? Because it's a dangerous throw. Desmond Ritter's not making that throw. They're not letting Desmond Ridder make that throw. And I think rightfully the Steelers are like, well, we're just not gonna. We got nothing. We got nothing on offense right now. We are not going to develop anything on offense unless we start taking some risks. And I think the decision to fire Matt Canada, honestly, is probably a very easy one for the guys in that building.
Well, the only reason it was difficult, Davis, is because it's an old-fashioned organization, and they just don't believe in doing things that way. They just don't believe in firing coaches mid-season. They don't even really believe in firing coaches. They're so loyal, unless Ben Roethlisberger asks them to. They're just so loyal to their guy. This is the whole they've had 3 head coaches in my lifetime thing. But then all of a sudden, we go from no reliable play in the Steelers offense to maybe as many as 5, which is just wild. It shows how important play callers are, how important offensive scheme is, because this week against Arizona, I think, is a good litmus test, right? I mean, you're definitely playing Warren and Harris and Freiermuth. I mean, it's just, I don't know how. I get it if you have Travis Kelce or something like that, you're not playing Freiermuth. But I think Pickens and Johnson are actually both pretty good plays this week after what the Rams did last week. The Cardinals look like they're just dragging themselves home. And if the Steelers, they should be able to build on next week. Maybe there's some playoff heroes there. And I think that last week with the touchdown that Johnson got that Mike Tomlin didn't challenge, they didn't really take some shots to Pickens. They just need to score touchdowns. That's the other thing. The scoreboard, maybe you might not think it's a new look Steelers offense, but they've got New England, Indy, Cincinnati, Seattle. That's super reasonable if you're asking them to have good offensive games. Have you started looking at the playoff schedules, or do you find value in looking ahead to weeks 15 to 17 now and really sharpen the players' values, or are you still feeling like that's more fluid?
So, I definitely believe that is useful and valuable things to hold. But honestly, the true answer is I have so many fantasy teams. Like, I can't get there yet. Like, I'm trying to juggle doing waivers on 17 teams this morning and do like, oh, I have these dynasty teams, and oh, I lost Mark Andrews on this team. What do I need to do? Can I win this league? Can I ship this? So I think the playoff schedule stuff is interesting and useful, and there are probably fantasy football analysts who are like really good at that, and they're able to contextualize all of that information. Another thing you'll notice, though, the longer that you do this, is that the team that you think you're playing in week 17, they're not going to be that team, whether it be there are so many. I mean, right, the Bengals would be a great one. Like, oh, we're going against the Bengals and it's going to be this. Oh, nope, we got Jake Browning, and it just like that game stinks now. Like I think probably you are more likely to get overly informationally comatose by looking at that stuff. The Texans, great example. Derrick Henry, right? First year of Derrick Henry's career, I was really interested in drafting him because he got to play the Texans twice in the fantasy football playoffs. That looks awful right now. I mean, Derrick Henry is going to get like 11 carries combined in those two games because the Texans are just going to smoke them. They're just going to be up 14 points the entire game,
Right. Yeah, that's, I mean, another great example of don't assume that the range of possibilities is wider than we think. It's always wider than we think. Who had CJ Stroud breaking Andrew Luck's rookie passing record? I mean, and I hope he does it in 16 games so people won't complain. I hope he does it in week 17. Who had him turning Tank Dell and Nico Collins into league winner type because they were so cheap pickups. So yeah, absolutely. So you mentioned the waiver wire process. This is good. I want to dive into this a little bit. Give me a name that is coming up as you're going through your waivers this week. You mentioned, well, Dearness Johnson, that was a good one. Is there anybody else? Because that is somebody that truly is on the waiver wire. You're probably looking at Dearness Johnson. Maybe people haven't seen yet that, well, number one, he's still a pretty solid running back. Number two, that Tank Bigsby, bad things seem to happen as often as good things whenever his number is called.
I think Tank Bigsby is just like not an NFL running back.
No, it doesn't look like it.
Yeah.
Dearness Johnson is, though. I'll give you a name. Well, let me toss this one out since we talk about CJ Stroud. What about Brevin Jordan?
Yeah, I mean, Brevin Jordan is probably like a top 15 tight end for whatever time frame Dalton Schultz would be out. I got another. I've been waiting for this guy to get run in the NFL forever, but I'm pretty sure Lynn Bowden is just going to have to start for the Saints this week. And the Saints do, I mean, look, they love to use Lynn Bowden is like slot wide receiver Taysom Hill. I mean, obviously, I think Taysom Hill is like so good, does not get enough credit for being like this unbelievable guy, like special teams, tight end, running back, quarterback. But Lynn Bowden, I think, is like a super interesting play this week. And then Greg Dortch. I mean, Greg Dortch.
Yes.
In his career, in games where he has over 65% of the routes in a given game, he averages over 13 fantasy points per game. And Zach Pascal was back last week. He already beat that hurdle. Now, this is very interesting. What does this coaching staff do? Because Rondale, I liked Rondale as a prospect. He has just really not been a good NFL player. He really has not. So do you play Michael Wilson and let Rondale keep playing? Or do you play Michael Wilson and say, good job, good effort. We're actually going to play Dortch because Dortch is better. Pretty interesting.
Yeah, it is. Well, and he got that garbage time touchdown, and Steelers this week. My Steelers neurosis tells me the Steelers might have problems with Kyler Murray. It's exactly the kind of game the Steelers lose.
Oh, I think they will have problems with him. Yeah.
Yeah. So yeah, maybe it's Greg Dortch, and the Saints offense is just going to be interesting this week. We'll see if Chris Olave is going to be ready. Rashid Shaheed won't. It feels like a Taysom Hill game. I mean, that's another thing that if you could go back in time a certain amount, a year or two, and say Taysom Hill is going to be an important fantasy football tight end, and it would just be incoherent. I know those words, but together they don't make any sense. And yet here we are, because I think the Saints have finally figured out that the more they use him, the better things go for their offense, and the better things. And why wouldn't that be the case? Because it keeps the defense off balance. And he's actually good at football. He actually is he's not a gimmick anymore. And
Yeah.
I for one hope there's more Taysom Hills out there, right? It's really interesting again on this topic of you do this long enough, you see things change, because you mentioned Rondale Moore. What's sad about Rondale Moore is that players like Rondale Moore
Every NFL team wants that guy now.
right.
Every NFL team wants their own Rond. I mean, it's Short King Summer, right? Tutu, that huge for the Rams. Tank Dell, Achane, Jalen Hyatt just had his first career game. Like, and I think it's a total response to the cover 2 safety stuff, because it's just a lot easier when you're 5'8", 160 pounds to get open than it is when you're 6'2", 220 pounds. It's just a total. It's the NFL meta. It's the most effective tactic available is to use skinnier, smaller wide receivers now. Like, no question about it.
And I think the spacing has something to do with it again. Probably right around the time that you were really becoming the take craft smith that you are, Davis. It was at the very end of, how many snaps did this quarterback take from under center in college? Because that prepares them for the pro game. We don't want to draft quarterbacks high that only work out of the shotgun, right? What did Joe Burrow do like most of the second half of the year last year, right? It's not taboo in the NFL to have offenses that look like college offenses, and players that we used to say, well, that worked in college. He's a force in college, but it's never going to translate to the NFL.
Yeah, I wish someone would tell coaches that, though, because, I mean, how many guys are good college quarterbacks and then they come to the NFL and it looks like they don't have a clue? I mean, we're going to see it this upcoming year. I don't know which one it'll be, but one out of Jaden Daniels, Caleb Williams, Drake May, maybe Shadur Sanders, maybe JJ McCarthy, one of these guys is going to be drafted in the first round, start week 1, and just never get there. Just look bad the entire time. I don't know which one it'll be, but it's going to happen, and it's a bummer.
Yeah, it is. Well, it's probably because the quarterback position, one thing that's become clear, it's still very inexact to project this, but it's so much more like a psychological, emotional, spiritual kind of position than a physical position. Even though physical tools are important, you can have all the physical tools in the world, and if it's like smoke comes out of your ears when the ball snapped because of the speed and danger and risk of making mistakes everywhere you look, then that's how it's going to go for you. And it's going to be really interesting. We mentioned Arizona. We were talking about Arizona, and it's really 2 quarterbacks. It's not one. I'm just curious your thoughts. And there's fantasy football takes to this. We're far enough in the fantasy season now that we don't really need to spend a lot. A lot of what there is to say has already been said multiple times already this year. But I do think it's but it's fun because it gives us a chance to spread out and talk about other things. But I think with both Kyler Murray and Justin Fields, both of these organizations have 2 first-round picks. Both of these organizations are going to have early first-round picks. Both of these organizations are going to be able to pick whichever one of those 4 quarterbacks or 5 quarterbacks or 3 that they want, if they want. But they have choices here. And on the flip side, you could say there are teams that could look at Justin Fields and look at Kyler Murray, depending on where Arizona and Chicago are with these guys, and maybe they could be a trade target. Maybe you say, certain teams that are in the wilderness right now, Atlanta comes to mind, right, would say, we would happily take Justin Fields or Kyler Murray. Take whichever part of it's most interesting to you. Do you keep these guys? Do you build around them? Is it really important to not build around them because you're dooming yourself to their limitations? Do you think they can be a franchise saver for somebody else?
I mean, I don't see any way that a quarterback as good as Kyler Murray should ever be allowed to leave the team that he's on. And maybe that is irrational by me. I can't really think of a quarterback that I've thought of as being as good as Kyler Murray changing teams. I mean, I guess Rodgers did just leave the Packers to go to the Jets, but normally
they do it when they're old.
Yeah, not Kyler Murray is like basically hitting his prime right now. He's hitting the combination of like he can still run and scramble about as good as he did when he was a rookie, but he also kind of has the metaphysical realization of how the NFL works. And I know they did just get absolutely skunked by the Rams, but to me, Kyler's basically looked like Kyler.
Mhm.
And I think, another year with this coach who I think was better than we imagined in the offseason, kind of seemed like he was going to be a damp squib, but I think he's got them playing pretty hard. Certainly the roster is not all that talented. They're going to have the ability to add Marvin Harrison Jr. to this offense. I don't know if they're going to take that, but they'll have the opportunity to do it. I mean, I actually think there are enough questions about Caleb Williams and Drake May that you got to ask yourself a real question. Do I take this guy, or do I just write it out with Kyler, a guy I've had in my building for 5 years, a guy who's on this contract, saves ourselves a lot of heartbreak of having to trade him and deal with all that? On the Fields thing, I was saying this to someone earlier today. I think Fields, to me, is kind of in the Sam Bradford zone, where it could have worked out for him, but just everything that could have went wrong for him early in his career did. Wrong coach, wrong team, wrong city, wrong wide receivers, too much change, too many injuries. Just, it was way too turbulent. And in a different multiverse, Sam Bradford is winning MVPs and winning the Super Bowl, and it all happens for him. And I think the same thing is true for Justin Fields, but I don't think it's this universe. And I think Fields should go be the quarterback of the Falcons or the Buccaneers next year. And they should have, Drake May or Caleb or JJ McCarthy or whoever.
Right. Whoever their process leads them to. Yeah. What you're talking about implicates two things. One is, I call it imprinting, where I think that the first 2 or 3 years of a quarterback's career, it's like human development, right? And depending on the conditions they're subjected to in those first 2 or 3 years, it completely changes what's possible in their career. And we can look at Andrew Luck's name's already come up, right? Andrew Luck. And what did Andrew Luck and Sam Bradford have in common? Like, they were just, when Luck was a rookie, the metaphor I used, Davis, was they just dropped him in behind enemy lines and said, shoot your way out, and that's too much. That's just too much. But the other thing it brings up, and Cecil and I talked about this on the show a week or two ago, is a thought experiment that I think is fascinating is, if Carolina had drafted CJ Stroud number 1 and Bryce Young had gone to the Texans at number 2, would it still look the same? Would Stroud still be the story of the league? Is Stroud so good? Is his destiny so strong that even in a bad organization, he would just elevate that organization? Or is that story over there in Houston also about D'Amico Ryans and Bobby Slowick and Nick Caserio? And if Bryce Young was there, we wouldn't be thinking of him as a colossal bust. We wouldn't think, well, he was too small, or he can't drive the ball, or whatever you think the reason is. How much do you think the environment's affected the first year of these quarterbacks, or how much is it just they got the right quarterback or they got the wrong quarterback?
I mean, like with everything, it's a little bit of both,
Sure.
right? I actually think, no, I'm actually going to go the other way. I think it's they each got the good quarterback. I don't think, and I'm happy to be wrong about this, because like you'll say a negative thing about a young quarterback and people will be like, why are you, like, just whatever. I would love for Bryce Young to prove me so wrong and show up on Sunday and like look incredible and be throwing dimes and throw for 350. Like, more good quarterbacks in the NFL is the good thing. I just think the issue we are arriving at is that Bryce is too small. I think he actually has the right mechanics and mental acuity and things like that. I just literally think he is too small to succeed with all these guys around him in the NFL. And maybe he figures it out. Maybe he gets better. Right now, he's basically having the worst yards per attempt season of any rookie quarterback. I believe the last guy was Cade McCown.
Mm-hmm.
But this is like worse than Josh Rosen for that Cardinals team right now. Like, it is dire for Bryce.
Yeah, it is really bad. And the sad thing for him is, you might say, well, no, it's just because the organization is bad, but he's still going to be in this organization. So the same process that led them to Frank Reich, because that's the thing, you could even say it was the right move for them to fire Frank Reich because the team was listless, right? And he seemed like he was checked out. Somebody, I can't remember who it was, pointed out that he said, this is probably my last stop. Well, here's the thought. Don't ever hire a coach who says this is probably my last stop. Like, don't ever hire a coach who's thinking, yeah, I'm probably not going to take another job after this. Sorry if that's ageism or something like that, but the NFL is so demanding that if a coach is already thinking like, I don't know if I really want to coach after this job, then chances are, especially in an organization like the Panthers, that it's not going to go well. But the same person, David Tepper, is going to be making this decision for the next coach and the next the organizational ethos that
Yep.
Bryce Young will have to develop or not develop in. But you're right to say that it's possible that Bryce Young, and it isn't strictly height, it's also that he's just kind of slight. He's not as physically formidable
He
as
probably
a Kyler Murray.
weighs 180 pounds, man.
Right.
He's so. I mean, that's got to be the smallest guy who started a game since like Doug Flutie. It's so small.
Yeah, it's going to be real interesting to see how that goes out. And it's kind of old school NFL scouting, like all the way around to old school NFL scouting, where I remember from my time on the draft scene that and some teams still have these for certain positions. Like, an offensive tackle has to have 34-inch arms and things like that. The quarterback's in 9.5-inch hands, where there were thresholds and teams would just say, if you're outside of these thresholds, you're off the list. Sorry. Like, just nope, we're not going to draft you. And that's seemingly old school thinking, but it comes all the way back around to where, it's not newfangled analytics to say a quarterback has to be physically formidable enough, even if they're short, to hang in the NFL. But I think the other side of to give CJ Stroud credit, just digging around a little bit, I read an article about Stroud that came out when he was a senior, and his dad went to prison when he was like 14 or 15 or 16, and his family it was really difficult for his family. They were living in an apartment above like a storage unit, and I think one of the quotes about him was he didn't have private coaches, he didn't have all these clothes and shoes and everything like that. He made himself, he did it himself. And I see him and how calm he is. Like, he has that same kind of eerie calm that Joe Burrow has about him. And I feel like his team is just responding to him because he has such incredible belief in himself. And he's here, he's here to do this. And I wonder if the whole ethos of the Carolina organization, basically like everyone's afraid to get fired or be on the wrong side of David Tepper or whatever, makes everybody tentative and meek and feeble. And that's what they look like. Anyway, I think it's an interesting thought of how much, the cover guy, a potential playoff hero, is that I asked him to put on the thumbnail here that's going to show up on YouTube. It's Brock Purdy. I think Brock Purdy would we have ever even cared about Brock Purdy if some other team drafted him? Would we have ever even said his name?
This was the one spot he could have succeeded, right? Of all the available NFL spots, this is the spot where he could have. Maybe Minnesota, actually. They kind of played that same West Coast, just connect the dots as the passer. I think he could have succeeded there, but yeah, I definitely don't think that's wrong at all.
Yeah, it's so fascinating. Again, like environment. Again, this stuff gets into human psychology and human development, nature versus nurture, and things like that. So somebody who probably has a lot of interesting ideas about nature versus nurture. The practice window is open for Aaron Rodgers. Yeah, at least Aaron Rodgers gives us fascinating, different types of stories. So is there something, we talk about playoff heroes, Garrett Wilson, Breece Hall. Is there really something to this? Is Aaron Rodgers going to blow up our expectations of Achilles' recovery?
No. Aaron Rodgers is not going to play. So this is what they've got set up, right? This is great for Rodgers. They can open up the practice window. Then by the time his practice window is done, they'll be officially mathematically eliminated from playoff contention, and he'll be able to say, I was ready to put my body on the line. I was ready to give it all for this team, but I'm not playing in what amounts to an exhibition game. So I'm not playing. It's exactly what he wants, right? And he'll be able to go on the McAfee show and be like, I was ready to go.
Right.
I was going to play, but just medically, it doesn't make any sense for me to risk it when there's no chance of making the playoffs. Like that's exactly what's going to happen.
Yeah. Well, I mean, you're right to think of it in terms of things being set up. Why I think it's reasonable to consider that is Aaron Rodgers is extremely aware of how he's perceived. So
yeah,
he he probably is concerned about that, maybe more than other players might be. So I think that's definitely feasible. And the poor Jets, just the poor Jets. It was all this quarterback talk, like the themes emerging, and you were talking about Arizona and Chicago and the decisions. One of the things that just occurred to me as I was reflecting on the Jets this morning was you really can't get top 5 quarterback picks wrong unless you're San Francisco. You cannot get them wrong. You're setting your franchise back 5 years if you get it wrong. And they've done 2 in a row with Darnold and Wilson. And that's how they ended up here. And that's why it seems like no matter what else they get right, they're still going to be the Jets. And, that's just where we are. What trying to think of other things as, again, I don't want to say it gets stale. It does
No,
seem to get
it does, because so much of what happens in the NFL right now is like we have a very well set, defined range of outcomes, and who wins your league is going to be like, well, who stays healthy? You had Jonathan Taylor coming back for a playoff. Oh, sorry, you held on to Zach Moss, you win. I mean, that's just there's so much you can do in preparation for the season, and early on, winning the waivers and things like that. I mean, what are you going to do right now? You spent all your waiver money. Sure, you can make some moves on the edges. You can take, you can pick up Greg Dortch. Maybe you get a nice little run, but you're probably not finding Devin Achane on the waivers right now. The next 50-point guys right now. It's just not happening.
No, I think that what you can do, and that's a good topic, like what can you do right now? I think the most important thing you do is you preparing. Well, you're in one of 2 modes. When redraft, there's a third mode, which is just you're trying to be a good sport and set your lineup so that other teams don't get a cheap win. But there's the Hail Mary, like you need to win each of your last 2 games, and that's what you're focused on. And then you just get in the playoffs and hope something good happens. Or I think one of the most important things to do right now, what I was doing this morning, as you're talking about the process of looking at your teams and things like that, is looking at your bench and not looking at the first guy on your bench, but the second, and saying, am I okay with that guy? And start to really consider, because like you said, by the time we get to week 17, the picture is going to be different, and not necessarily going to be different because offenses are going to get better or worse. Teams are going to figure things out after the bye or something like that. But because of injuries, and also because you're going to see, as teams understand where their season is headed, it becomes more unpredictable. I mean, the playoff teams are going to continue to play hard, and teams that are striving for the playoffs. The other teams, like I'm really interested in Washington this weekend. They're at the low point of their season. Ron Rivera is probably out after this year. So how does that team respond against Miami? Or is this a team that we're just going to look at as a total tomato can? Or are they going to be like the team that played Philadelphia really tough twice this year, and they're going to be a little more difficult to project? But I think that that's one of the things you can do, and that's where you get into pickups like Dearness Johnson at the very end of your bench, and pickups like, depending on how your tight end situation is, somebody like a Brevin Jordan, or even Isaiah Likely, or Juwan Johnson, and so on.
Oh yeah, I mean, if you picked up Likely, I think you won the Yahtzee, because they didn't have to throw the ball that much. I mean, the Chargers just didn't push them at all. But I mean, he just played Mark Andrews' role. I mean, there was no, and the thing you could have been worried about was more 11 or 10 personnel or anything like that. That didn't happen. Bateman ran more routes than Beckham. Actually, Van Aguilar ran more routes than Beckham did. Like, Likely is going to be, he might be the guy you picked up that actually makes the difference in the fantasy football playoffs, because I mean, the tight end position is the tight end position this year. It's sort of, we've made this joke forever that we always think that that tight end is deep in the off season, and then we get to the regular season and it's not deep. Well, it actually is deep this year, but it's not deep in the way you want it to be. It's deep with a bunch of guys who score about 8.5 points per game. So we've got, after Laporta and Kittle, everyone from Cole Kmet all the way down to Pat Freiermuth is averaging between 8 and 10.5 points per game. And it is just like, sure, you can pick up a guy who's fine, but there's like, I guess, really just 2 guys at the position who have been better than fine, which is Kelsey and Hawkinson.
Yeah, that's it. And One thing, I mean, again, fantasy football, conventional wisdom, and things like that. Like very quietly, rookie tight ends can't matter. It's dead, totally dead. We had two,
Oh
and
yeah.
if the Green Bay pass offense wasn't so spread out, and if Luke Musgrave could stay healthy, we might have had three. Uh, every week start. Well, Dalton Kincaid took a little while to get going, but you get it. And you're right. It does seem to follow that same pattern, but at the same time, that's why it can be that much more valuable if you catch the right player at the right time going into the playoffs. And Isaiah Likely absolutely could be that guy because, and this is one of those things where I don't know if I'm making excuses and not seeing what's happening, or if I'm correctly identifying what's going on, because it feels like every week Lamar Jackson's a disappointment, right? Every week Baltimore's pass offense is a disappointment. But like you said, the game scripts lately have not been pushing them to be passing. But when you see Jacksonville, San Francisco, Miami coming up, here's the fantasy playoffs. Jacksonville, San Francisco, Miami sure sound like games that Baltimore's offense isn't going to be able to just coast home to a victory. There's going to be games where they're going to have to push the passing capabilities of their offense to keep up with those good offenses. And that's when Isaiah Likely could come alive. And let's bring up another potential hero, another guy that fits into the Achane, Atwell, Dell, the undersized mold. What about Keaton Mitchell?
So the issue with Keaton Mitchell is I don't think they're going to give him the goal line stuff, and that's the only stuff that really matters in the Ravens backfield. We've been saying this for years. Feels like J.K. Dobbins' entire life. We've been waiting for J.K. Dobbins to catch passes, and I don't know, maybe he would have caught some passes this year, but it's a total if it's broke, don't fix it thing with Gus Edwards, where you get the ball on the 3-yard line, you hand the ball to Gus Edwards. And it's like the most frustrating thing in the world because he's taking touchdowns away from Flowers and Andrews and Bateman and Lamar. And it just, they don't care. They don't care about your fantasy football team. They're just handed. And I think that Keaton did already supplant Justice Hill, which I think was a pretty big obstacle to clear as like an undrafted free agent rookie, is to supplant this guy who's been on the team since like the Ronald Reagan presidency. Feels like Justice Hill has been a Raven my entire life, but I think that's about the max of his role. I mean, the Keaton Mitchell weeks will be the weeks where he scores a 37-yard touchdown. So like definitely don't drop Keaton Mitchell, and he's a fine running back 2 starter. But Achane was getting goal line carries in his first game. Second game. Second game, he was getting carries inside the 5-yard line. And I don't think they do. They could do that for Mitchell, but I don't think they will.
Yeah, that might be the key difference because Achane, you could get the big plays from Mitchell. And Baltimore's offense, it might not put defenses in compromising positions as well as Miami's does, but it has potential to. We saw what they did against Detroit was pretty impressive. Until that game, I feel like Baltimore broke Detroit's spirit on defense because the Detroit defense was overachieving, and there's injuries in other parts of the story too. They were overachieving, and then they went to Baltimore, and Baltimore humbled them, and they haven't really been the same since. And that's another thing that is, Detroit is another one. You can look at Detroit or Detroit's opponents as being keys to how the fantasy football season is going to go from here. But hey, I'm just glad that the Ravens are doing it with some non-traditional players. Isaiah Likely was not highly touted, and he certainly wasn't expected to become a good two-way tight end like he is already in year 2. Keaton Mitchell, like you said, undrafted. So, and they're using these players, and they were using Isaiah Likely right away too. So they're not, the good organizations don't really care about how much they invested in a player once they see them play. And that decides how things go forward. And bad organizations, yeah, so I guess before we go, and that's the thing, right? That's going back to, there's nothing that's too absurd to say it's possible in the NFL because there are such bad organizations. There's no statement that is too absurd to say a team will do something for a really bad reason, or a team will refuse to do something for a really bad reason. I guess I'll ask you this. Go ahead.
Well, I just was thinking off the top of that, like the whole Falcons thing, the idea of hiring this very conservative backwards coach and then just handing him, a Mercedes, a Lamborghini, and a Ferrari, and then he just keeps them in the garage so that he can keep driving his John Deere tractor around. Like,
right.
I feel like the tenor of the conversation is now sort of like, oh, well, what do you expect Arthur Smith to do? He's got Desmond Ridder and Taylor Heineke.
Right.
Well, I mean, first, they could have Lamar Jackson. They could have Derek Carr. They could have got, Aaron Rodgers. Like, the how much this last offseason was like the most quarterback movement in NFL history, I believe. It's going to happen again this offseason. Why can't Kyler Murray be the quarterback of the Atlanta Falcons? Like, he definitely could if things go a certain way. But we all are we're just like, yeah, that's what the Falcons do. Cordarrelle Patterson's going to get 12 touches in the ground game. There's nothing you can do about it. Van Jefferson is going to get more targets than Kyle Pitts. Just be happy about it,
Right.
And it's like, that's crazy. If a guy at a bank, like a stock, like a trader, made a decision as bad as taking Kyle Pitts, where the Falcons took Kyle Pitts and then throwing the ball to him less than Jonnu Smith, they'd be fired immediately.
Well, and that's so you led right to where I was going. This is good. This is great. You anticipated where I was going, because the question, the way I brought it up on our show this morning, with Cecil, was, is it time to enter the acceptance phase of Kyle Pitts as a bust?
No, I'll never get there. Never. I'm still holding out hope for Hunter Henry.
See, I thought you were going to make this reasoned argument about Kyle Pitts and the kind of routes they've been using him on and things like that. You're like, no. It's just my personality. I'm with you. I'm with you.
Well, do you see anything in the way he plays that would indicate that he's not as good as we thought?
There's one thing. Well, first of all, again, we have to bring up the psychological, emotional, spiritual part. It's not all physical. The game,
true.
Yogi Berra, like, is 90% physical, the rest, other half's mental or whatever. No matter how. Now, there might be some exceptions, like a position like defensive end, where you're really only performing for like 3 seconds, and it's just strictly based on like your burst and your brute physical football strength, functional strength. I did see one clip. I can't remember who posted it during the season, but it showed that they were starting to use Kyle Pitts more like banana-shaped routes that were just asking him to like slightly change his direction instead of actually make any kind of breaks. And that was working a little bit better. And that when you watched him trying to make breaks, it did not look comfortable. It did not look fluid. And I guess, this is kind of the issue is still open. So there's the Arthur Smith issue, but then there's also the issue of, well, if Kyle Pitts was really as good as he's billed, then at some point it shouldn't matter, right? At some point,
that's you know what? Maybe that's actually ultimately where I should be. Is like, the bell curve meme, right? The dumb guy, the middle IQ guy, and the Jedi. I actually think Kyle Pitts used to be the left and right. Like, the Kyle Pitts is awesome, so who cares? I actually think now Kyle Pitts has become the middle IQ, where it's like, no, you don't understand. The targets per route run are still really. No, I actually think you're probably right. Like, he might just stink. He might just not be good.
Well, or just that what made him so dominant in college doesn't translate to the NFL when you're playing against NFL defenses. Now we'll see. We'll see with this, potential second coach or second team or whatever. But I will say that there's probably only been like 3 or 4 at the most moments in his career where he looked like a player deserving of a top 5 overall pick. And the thing is, even if Atlanta had taken him, he was going to go like top 5 or 6. So I don't think Atlanta made a colossal mistake. I just think that there are players that we think are can't miss that miss. It just, the NFL always has players that they say are can't miss, and that's why people always caution against using that term. And we'll see. But I think, this is on the couch. Psychologically, I'm wondering, in the Elizabeth Kubler-Ross terminology, if it's time to just move. We're not bargaining anymore. We're not in denial. We're just accepting it, and we'll see. All right. Speaking of on the couch, now we're off the rails. Yeah, man, we've spent a lot of time together and talked about a lot of stuff. It's cool. And what I like is you'll go there. I really love that
I
because
love
I
to go
mean,
there.
well, it's great to go there. I guess I will say because probably it's the last time we're going to talk this year since it's week 13. First, I want to say like, what's on your agenda when the season's over and you get your brain back?
I like to read a lot when the season is over. Go on long walks with my dog. Travel. I would say travel a little bit, but I am of the age where every weekend is spent at a wedding.
Ah,
So actually, I will just enjoy some nice, calm, relaxing downtime at home. I mean that 30 to 33. I'm 31 right now. I mean I'm about to go to my 10th wedding of the year this upcoming weekend. So I'm very excited. Really the reading thing though, like right about when the playoffs start and we're heading in, I'll some series, whatever. I'll just be bookworming it out.
yeah, that's good. I mean, that's something you need time to do to stack. Well, I'm old enough now that sometimes we're listening to books, and
Oh
that's
yeah.
I don't know if there's been any studies done about whether you absorb as much or it's as nutritious for your brain to listen to a book as it is to read. But it certainly feels really calm and comforting. I mean, who didn't like having someone read a story to them when you were a kid, right? And we've been listening to. Have you ever read *Devil in White City*, the book about the Chicago World's Fair and H. Holmes? You
No, so
familiar
I've
with it?
listened to I am because I've listened to a great podcast, the Time Suck
Mm.
podcast. People might like that one. It's kind of like a history comedy sort of pod. It's pretty good. But yeah, I am familiar with the story.
It's just so fascinating. Um, Revisiting we've been watching a lot of Chicago stuff too. We're headed to Chicago over the break. They have some big Christmas, like a German Christmas market they do down in Daly Plaza, which is going to be fun for me. Just as like my first favorite movie, I would stay up until like 2 a.m. to watch the Blues Brothers when I was like 4 years old because I had no parental supervision. If you want to know how I got this way, and being down at Daly Plaza for the movie culminated, that's going to be fun. But it is really fascinating to revisit like things like the efforts that were made when the world was becoming to show like what the future was going to bring, and now to be like so far past that, and also to know it's kind of sad that the world doesn't seem to make those kinds of efforts anymore to have optimism about the future, right? I guess that's another fun one to go. um what are you optimistic about, or what do you I know you're a big picture thinker kind of like me, and these are not good times, right? It does not
No,
feel like there's a lot to be optimistic about, or otherwise. I think that, I mean, it's it's almost something nobody wants to talk about, but it does feel like everything is getting harder for everybody. Everything is diminishing in like quality or the amount of satisfaction it gives you. And people like us, we're lucky, right? Just that because if we followed our ridiculous impulses, somehow ended up in a comfortable spot where the bargain we have to make with the world is okay. But for a lot of people, it's not. So where do you find? You mentioned walks with your dog. Where do you find like optimism? Where do you find like uplifting outlooks?
all right. I'm gonna go really next level, like
Hmm.
beyond. I think the
What?
the thing you could be most optimistic about would be humanity figuring out mass space travel and colonization, colonizing other planets, figuring out like light speed
Hmm.
travel, things like that. I think that is, we are whatever science fiction you liked growing up. I mean, we are past that now.
Hmm.
I mean, the amount of things that we've learned. We have photos of galaxies, 10,000 light years away. We can see, I think that to the stars is
Hmm.
probably the thing that you could be, in our lifetime. The amount of access we have in our galaxy and in the universe, I think, will change dramatically. That's ultimately where I would land.
See, I'll flip what you said and say that um, all of the like ultra rich people, they're gonna go because of
And
how
they're
we've
going to leave
upset.
us here.
And then over time, things are going to get better, and we're going to return back to ways that got us this far in the first place. And they're going to tell stories like they told you about Atlantis, that a long time ago, humans reached some pinnacle. Isn't that why this story is recurring in so many traditions, right? That there was a point when humans reached a pinnacle in the past, and then it all collapsed. And we're in the wake of that, the flood, whatever, and maybe, I mean, because honestly, this is where I know you and I don't want to put words in your mouth, but that's maybe one of the best things that could happen for Earth, right? If you took like the 1,000 richest people and they left to colonize Mars or something like that, like, can we get that in writing, please? Because we can hack it, in all of us, or in the DNA of every single one of us. Like, if you're listening to this right now, in your DNA are ancestors who knew how to survive, a lot of hairy, unforeseen stuff, right? Like, way different than the puzzle we have of how do I earn money, or
I mean,
what do I do with my
humanity
money.
has gone in that direction before. I mean, the Roman Empire, the peak of the Roman Empire was 1,000 years before feudalism in Europe, right? I mean, we had full, advanced, insanely modern societies, and then we had, damp darkness, people not knowing how to read or write, thatched roofs. Like, society, it doesn't feel this way because obviously the rate of change the last 50 years is the highest rate of change in the history of the planet ever. But it's totally possible. It's the Dark Ages Part 2 is totally in the range of outcomes.
Or more like parts. I mean, in a lot of native traditions, Davis, this is our 5th time around. We've done this 4 times.
Yeah.
And I definitely feel like that what perspective I've gained in my time here on Earth is that things are circles. They're not lines with beginnings and ends, right? The nature of everything is a circle, or like a helix, at least. Not we like to think, because our lives have a beginning and end, that's how this is all shaped. But I don't think that. One of the things I think that it's so fascinating to consider too, is that, like, in quantum physics, time, it all works the same. Physics works the same frontward or backward in time. The one thing that they have figured out that does not adhere to that, Davis, is consciousness. Consciousness only happens in one direction.
Wow.
So
that's kind of that's not kind of interesting. That's very interesting.
It gets to things like, I think we might have talked about this before. If not, you and I know I've talked about this. There's an article I'd read about philosophy. It was like he was a neurologist and a philosopher, and he came up with this theory that, like, an ontology, that like all there is consciousness, right? Because in quantum physics,
that's like a pretty common thought, right? Is that the only provable entity is your own thought, not even your body or your brain, but literally your own thoughts.
Right. And therefore, in quantum physics, like the observer, right? Like, quantum physics tells us that all there really is a cloud of probabilities. This gets right back to fantasy football. All there really is a cloud of probability. And only when you would introduce an observer, only when you introduce a consciousness, does it become something, But that's why we're here. Maybe. And we're here to make choices, right? Again, back to fantasy football. We're here to make choices. That much I figured out. I know that sounds like for a big, what have you learned in 48 years? That sounds pretty banal or basic, but I think a lot of the most important truths, all of them, are basic, really. I like to say the secrets of the universe are not secret, but it's no secret that Davis Mattek has been giving us great information, great takes, and just been a wonderful asset in on the couch in our fantasy football world. And we'll continue to hang out as often as we can with all of y'all, because you give us the privilege to just be ourselves and do what we like. And hopefully we can give you a little something back for that. And we always want to serve you. We want to help you win that championship. You deserve it, because